A few years ago, I decided to take a trip to visit my family. I planned to spend a week with them, relax, and then head to the coast for another week before returning home. I desperately needed the break because I had just ended a messy and emotionally draining relationship. It was one of those on-again, off-again situations that went on for 7 exhausting months. Everyone says you should fight for what's important, right? But eventually, I realized I was fighting for something that wasn't worth the toll it was taking on me. So, I ended it for good. No more second chances, no more trying to make it work. I was done. Being with my family was like hitting a reset button. For the first few days, I mostly slept. My mom, a nurse, was worried that something was wrong with me physically. But honestly, I just needed a safe place to process everything. I wasn't sick, I was exhausted. After those initial days of recovery, I started to feel like myself again. Before we left for the coast, I met up with an old friend from school. We'd stayed in touch, so it wasn't weird that he reached out. I thought it would just be the two of us catching up, but he brought along another guy. It didn't bother me, though. We hung out for a while, and then I had to leave because it was getting late, and I had a long drive home. I could either take the quicker rural route through the woods or the main road, which would add about 20 minutes to my drive. I chose the shortcut, but since it was through a wooded area, I had to watch out for deer. As I drove, something felt off. My stomach churned with this uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I slowed down instinctively, and thank goodness I did, because a deer suddenly appeared in the middle of the road. I managed to avoid it, but that weird feeling stayed with me. To make matters worse, I noticed another car driving behind me. The unease only grew stronger, so I decided to take the main road instead of the shortcut. I stopped at a gas station, thinking maybe I was just overthinking things. I grabbed some water and ginger ale, but the feeling lingered. Not wanting to head straight home, I drove around for a bit to clear my head. Eventually, the uneasiness faded, and I went home, read for a while, and fell asleep. Fast forward 2 weeks. The trip was over, and I was back home trying to move on. Sorting through my emotions after the breakup was tough, but I knew it was necessary. I also decided to declutter my space. Something about clearing out my surroundings made me feel like I was clearing my mind, too. That afternoon, my phone rang. I don't get many calls, so I assumed it might be family. The area code matched my cousin's, so I answered without hesitation. To my surprise, it was the guy my friend had brought along to our meetup. It felt odd that he had gotten my number, but I didn't think much of it. He said he was at the airport, which I found strange, so I asked where he was going. That's when he dropped the bombshell. He wasn't leaving. He had just landed in my city and wanted me to pick him up. My mind froze. Wait, what? You flew here to see me? He claimed he felt a connection and wanted to be with me. At this point, I was oscillating between anger, confusion, and fear. I explained that I hadn't invited him and that "look me up sometime" was just a polite, throwaway comment. He then admitted he had no money for a hotel and asked if he could stay with me. Reluctantly, I agreed, but only for one night. When we got to my place, I made it crystal clear he was sleeping on the couch. He had the audacity to ask if he could sleep in my bed. I told him no in no uncertain terms and even mentioned I had a gun to dissuade any funny ideas. The next day, I went to work, but he kept blowing up my phone, demanding I come home for lunch. When I returned that evening, I walked into a nightmare. He had rearranged every room in my house. Furious, I confronted him. Instead of explaining, he accused me of talking to someone else and even claimed he'd contacted my ex. That was the final straw. I calmly told him to grab his things and that I was calling a cab to take him to the airport. He continued to argue, but when he saw I wasn't backing down, he left. For weeks afterward, he bombarded me with texts and calls from different numbers. I blocked every single one. Eventually, the messages stopped. I don't know where he is now, and honestly, I couldn't care less. Looking back, this whole ordeal still makes my skin crawl. How can someone you barely know misconstrue politeness as an invitation to invade your life? Do you think I handled the situation well, or would you have done something differently? And what do you think drives someone to act this way? Desperation, delusion, or something else entirely? 5 years ago, my fiancé and I had been living in our house for just over a year. At the time, I was a big guy, 6 feet tall, around 225 pounds, with a naturally muscular build and what many people described as an intimidating appearance. My fiancée, on the other hand, was petite, 5 feet 2 inches and about 130 pounds. Our house was a 2-story home, with stairs leading up to the living room and down to the basement as soon as you entered through the front door. The only way to access the backyard was through the sliding glass door in the upstairs living room, leading down a set of stairs from our deck. At that point in my life, I was partying way more than I should have. I didn't have a job, as it was the end of the holiday season, and finding work wasn't my priority. Most nights, I was out drinking with friends, often crashing on their couches until morning. This left my fiancée alone in the house with our 3 Great Danes more often than I like to admit. My drinking had become a serious problem, and it was putting a strain on our relationship. Eventually, I landed a new job that required random drug and alcohol tests, which turned out to be a blessing in disguise. I decided to quit drinking cold turkey. 2 days into my sobriety, I was already seeing the positive effects it had on my fiancée. She told me how happy she was that I was taking steps to change, and I reassured her that I was committed to improving myself and our relationship. Things seemed to be looking up. One night, we were sitting downstairs watching TV when I thought I heard something rustling outside in the backyard. Our dogs perked up, their ears twitching, but they didn't bark or act alarmed, so I dismissed it as some neighborhood cats messing around in the bushes. A few moments later, I heard the noise again, and this time, my fiancée quickly muted the TV. She looked at me with worry in her eyes and asked, "Did you hear that?" I told her it was probably just the cats again, but she shook her head, insisting it wasn't. Before I could ask why she was so sure, we both heard the unmistakable sound of the sliding glass door upstairs slamming open. In an instant, all 3 of our Great Danes were on high alert, barking furiously as they bolted up the stairs. I was right behind them, my heart pounding. Just as I reached the bottom of the second staircase, I saw the sliding glass door slam shut and a shadowy figure sprinting across our deck. Without thinking, I threw the door open, and the dogs rushed out ahead of me, barking like mad as they chased the intruder. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, the kind police officers use, and ran after them. By the time I reached the backyard, the dogs were snarling and jumping at the back fence. I vaulted over the fence just in time to see the man, a figure dressed entirely in black, climbing over the opposite fence. He wore a thin black hoodie with the hood pulled tight around his face and black cargo pants. Ignoring any concerns for my safety, I charged at him, but he scrambled over the fence before I could grab him. I kept chasing him, running around the front of my neighbor's house just in time to see him jump into an old, beat-up pickup truck. He sped off, tires screeching, disappearing into the night. I ran back home as fast as I could, adrenaline pumping through me. When I got inside, I found my fiancée sitting in the upstairs living room, clutching the largest kitchen knife we owned, surrounded by our protective Great Danes. She looked scared but determined, ready to defend herself if it came down to it. We immediately called the police, gave them our statements, and checked every door and window in the house to make sure everything was secure. Too wired to sleep, we decided to watch another movie to calm down. While the movie played, I asked her why she'd been so certain earlier that the noise wasn't just cats in the yard. Her answer made my stomach drop. She admitted that for the past month, she'd been hearing strange noises at night. Footsteps outside, whispers near the windows, but she hadn't told me because she wasn't sure if it was real or if she was imagining things. Her confession hit me like a ton of bricks. It dawned on me that whoever this man was, he must have known I was often out partying at night, leaving her alone. He'd likely been watching the house, waiting for the right moment to strike. What he didn't account for was our 3 enormous, fiercely protective dogs. That night marked a turning point in my life. I've stayed sober since that March, and I've never left my fiancée alone overnight again. Our relationship has grown stronger, and I've realized how much she and our safety mean to me. Our 3 Great Danes remain our vigilant guardians, and I'll never take them for granted. To the intruder who thought he could take advantage of a vulnerable moment, you were lucky to get away that night. Let's hope you've decided to leave people like us alone for good. But here's a question for everyone reading. How would you have handled that situation, and what steps do you take to ensure your home and loved ones are protected? A few years back, I lived on the first floor of an apartment building. My neighbor, Joe, lived right next door. He was a bit chubby, wore glasses, had a bowl cut, and often dressed in button-down shirts. One evening, just as the sun was setting, he knocked on my door. Joe needed someone to watch his dog over the weekend because of a sudden work trip, and he was asking around. Wanting to be a good neighbor, I agreed to help out. I asked for his phone number, just in case anything came up. At the time, I thought it was a smart move. In hindsight, it was a mistake. Joe seemed harmless enough. We talked for a bit about video games and Dungeons and Dragons, discovering we had a lot in common. I kept the conversation polite and friendly. I even made a point of brushing my hand across my face to show my wedding ring, hoping he'd understand that I wasn't interested in anything beyond neighborly courtesy. My husband was out of town, so I didn't give it much thought. Joe came back on Monday to pick up his dog and the spare key. I told him not to worry about paying me, but he insisted on repaying me in some way. He mentioned an escape room event his office was hosting and invited me to join him as his +1. Thinking it could be a fun way to make a new friend, I agreed. When the day came, though, I wasn't feeling well. I spent the day curled up on the couch with my dog, Cortana, and texted Joe to let him know I couldn't make it. I told him not to worry about owing me anything. His reply was short, okay. I didn't think much of it and went back to resting. Over the next few weeks, Joe started texting me more often. At first, it was random messages that didn't make much sense. Then, out of nowhere, he texted asking why I hadn't invited him to play Dungeons and Dragons. I was confused. I hadn't mentioned it to him, so he must have overheard me talking to my friend in the hallway. That's when things began to feel off. Outside Joe's apartment was a patch of grass where I often took Cortana. Normally, she was calm and focused on sniffing around. But one day, she started barking like crazy at Joe's window. The blinds were shut tight, and I couldn't see anything unusual, but her behavior was out of character. Feeling embarrassed, I pulled her away and tried to quiet her down. For the next several days, every time we went to that spot, Cortana would bark at Joe's window. To avoid the awkwardness, I started taking her elsewhere for her walks. When I returned after a week, I noticed the blinds were pulled all the way up and the window was open. Joe was leaning halfway out of the window, stretching dramatically. My first thought was, who does that? I gave him a quick, awkward hello, hurried Cortana along, and went back inside. A few days later, Joe started knocking on my door almost every night. I'd quietly approach the peephole and see him just standing there, waiting. Then came the texts. One night, he asked if he could take me out to dinner. I stared at my phone in disbelief, unsure how to respond. Not even 3 minutes later, he sent another message. I'm just trying to be friendly after you didn't come last time. Sorry for being friendly. I was completely shocked. Even Cortana seemed to sense my unease, sitting up to stare at me. I called my mom and explained what was happening. She was as worried as I was and suggested I set firm boundaries. She said I should tell Joe that my husband wouldn't be comfortable with me going out to dinner with another man and that his behavior was inappropriate. When I finally worked up the courage to send that message, Joe's persistent texts and visits stopped almost immediately, ignoring him, avoiding him, or leaving quickly whenever he opened his door hadn't worked, but mentioning my husband did. Even after that, Cortana still growled at Joe's window whenever we walked past. A few months later, I moved out of the apartment and thankfully, I never heard from Joe again. Looking back, I still wonder about Joe's behavior. Was he just socially awkward and oblivious, or did his actions hint at something more unsettling? What do you think? How would you have handled someone like Joe, and what steps would you take to protect yourself in a similar situation? 5 years ago, in my country, the only way to get alcohol if you were under 18 was to find someone willing to buy it for you outside a liquor store. That's exactly what my friends and I did one Friday evening. My 2 friends, Harriet and Cara, and I were meeting another friend later, so we needed to stock up first. After a few minutes of waiting outside the store, we found a guy willing to help us out. We handed him some cash and asked him to grab a few bottles of vodka. With the bottles secured, the next challenge was transferring the vodka into other containers. It was too risky to do it out on the street, so we headed to a nearby fast food place with public bathrooms. This was a routine for us. We'd sneak in, pour the alcohol into soda bottles or something less suspicious, and then continue our night. That evening, we picked a McDonald's we'd used before because it was always busy, and no one questioned three teenagers heading straight to the bathrooms without ordering anything. The three of us crammed into one stall and got to work. We were almost done when something weird happened. Just as we were about to leave, we heard a giggle. At first, we froze, unsure of where it was coming from. Then, I glanced up, and that's when I saw him. A man, probably in his 30s, was peeking down at us from the ceiling. His forehead and eyes were visible through a gap where one of the tiles had been lifted. He was giggling like it was the funniest thing in the world. "Hey, what are your names? Where are you going? Can I come along?" he asked, his tone playful but unsettling. We stood there, stunned, staring at him. Who the hell expects to find some random guy hiding in the ceiling of a McDonald's bathroom? Feeling brave, or maybe just dumb? I shot back, "You're creepy. Go away." But my words didn't faze him. He kept giggling and watching us, shifting around in the ceiling as if he was having the time of his life. Now, we weren't exactly in a position to report him immediately. Along with our vodka bottles, we had a couple of pre-rolled joints in our bags. The last thing we needed was someone calling the police on us. But as the guy kept staring and asking questions, "How old are you? Where do you live? Can I have some of your drink?" It became clear this wasn't just some harmless prank. Things got worse when he started lifting the ceiling tile further, as if he was trying to find a way down. Realizing the only way he could come down was to drop directly into the stall, we bolted. The three of us dashed out of the bathroom and regrouped outside. We were freaked out and trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to leave and forget the whole thing, but then I thought about other people, women, kids, who might use that bathroom later. I couldn't just walk away knowing he might still be up there, spying on them. I decided to go back in and tell the staff. I made up a terrible lie about being on the phone in the bathroom for a long time and spotting the guy in the ceiling. They didn't even question my story, they just looked annoyed. It was clear from their reactions that this wasn't the first time they dealt with something like this. A couple of male employees immediately went into the bathroom to check it out while I left, not wanting to stick around any longer. We never heard anything more about it. We still went to that McDonald's occasionally, but we never saw or heard about the ceiling guy again. I sometimes wonder if they ever caught him, or if he just moved on to another place. The whole thing was so bizarre, and it still creeps me out when I think about it. What do you think this guy was up to? Was he just a weirdo getting his kicks? Or was there something more sinister going on? And would you have done something different in my situation? This happened nearly a decade ago when I was 13, and my friend and I were beyond excited because it was our first Halloween trick-or-treating without our parents. We lived in a small, quiet town where not much ever happened, so we expected it to be just a regular night filled with candy and fun. The evening started off just like we imagined, going house to house, filling our bags with sweets, running into friends from school, and enjoying the spooky atmosphere. By 8 p.m., we figured it was time to head home, but we decided to make one last stop at our teacher's house before calling it a night. When we got to her street, things felt different. Most of the houses had their lights off, the Halloween decorations were already packed away, and the streetlights barely illuminated the road. It was eerily quiet, and we couldn't shake the disappointment of not finding any candy on that street. Suddenly, out of the shadows, a man stepped into view under a faint streetlight. We jumped, startled, but then realized he was wearing a police uniform. He introduced himself as an officer and started chatting with us. At first, he seemed nice enough, but as he spoke, something about him felt off. He pointed to a nearby house and told us that an older man who lived there had been inviting kids inside when they came trick-or-treating. He explained that someone had called the police about it, but when he knocked, no one answered the door. Then he added that his partner and patrol car were just around the corner. We glanced around but didn't see any sign of another officer or a police car. That's when my mom's voice echoed in my head. Her countless warnings from crime shows about people pretending to be cops to lure others into dangerous situations. As the officer kept talking, my gut started telling me something wasn't right. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. He seemed helpful, even friendly, and he was smiling in a way that almost put me at ease. Almost. Then he made a request that sent chills down my spine. He said he needed our help to catch the man in the house. His plan was for us to knock on the door while he hid behind some bushes nearby. If the man invited us inside, the officer would jump out and catch him. My friend and I froze. The idea of being bait in a police operation was terrifying. We exchanged wide-eyed glances, silently trying to figure out what to do. The street was so quiet that it felt like he could hear every breath we took. Sensing our hesitation, he grew impatient and told us to decide quickly. Before we could respond, a family appeared at the end of the street, walking toward us. As soon as the officer noticed them, he muttered something about being right back and disappeared into the shadows. He told us to stay put, but the second he was out of sight, we bolted. We didn't stop running until we were far from that street. On the way home, we tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was he really a cop? Was it some kind of prank? Or did we misinterpret a genuine officer trying to protect kids? When we told our parents, we downplayed the whole thing, unsure if we were overreacting. My dad decided to check out the street himself, but when he got there was no sign of a police car, the officer, or anything unusual. The house was dark and silent. The next day at school, we shared the story with our classmates and teacher, but most of them shrugged it off as no big deal. Looking back now, I regret not reporting it to the real police. If he was a fake cop, who knows what could have happened? And if he was a real officer, why on earth would he put 2 kids in such a risky situation? The whole encounter left so many unanswered questions that I've carried with me for years. What do you think? Could this have been a genuine officer with an unorthodox plan, or was it something much darker that we narrowly escaped?